so much, Paul, for having me and everyone for taking time out on a Tuesday night. Why I'm here tonight really starts with a turning point in my life almost 27 years ago. I was preparing to return to my investment banking job after my maternity leave, and I just couldn't do it. I look back on it as an emotional turning point, but at the time I would have said I was really at an emotional breaking point. I was 35 years old with a newborn baby, starting a family of my own. And I realized I needed to focus on healing from the effects of growing up in my family. And I couldn't do that working 90-hour weeks on Wall Street. People at the time thought I was making a great sacrifice to give up my career to be home with my child. Turned out he would be the first of three, but it was no sacrifice at all. Instead, my son became my face-saving way to exit a career that checked a lot of the boxes, but required of me to live at some distance from myself. That healing process of coming back home to myself over the decades that followed is really the story of everyone in this room, I expect, who is on their own path of healing and growth and spiritual alignment. So when people ask me how I managed to switch from iBanking to social work, I tell them truthfully that I didn't. Social work came later, and my transition to being a clinical social worker after being a full-time mom was really kind of an incremental change. The big change was choosing to focus on my personal growth and healing, really for my own selfish reasons. Having kids was the catalyst, and yes, they benefited, but that was a happy side effect of choosing what was best for me. A couple of years ago, I saw an interview of Pema Chodron. Some of you may know her. She's a Buddhist monk. She's a Western woman, Caucasian, she's in, I want to say she's in her 90s now, but she's one of the first in the modern era to bring Buddhist philosophy and practice to the West in an accessible way. And she was being interviewed. And at this stage of her life, her life in this final chapter of her life, and the interviewer asked her, so, what are you the most proud of? And she thought about it and she said, I'd have to say that I'm most proud of how I consistently brought myself back to my spiritual calling, that I listened and I strayed, but I came back and I came back and I came back again and again. I had that determination to do that. So the interviewer was kind of surprised by the answer and said, well, there are those millions of people whom you helped with your podcasts and your books and your workshops. And without skipping a beat, she said, oh, but that was completely an accident. And it was so authentic and spontaneous the way she said it, and it caught my attention. It's kind of how I feel that way about my own parenting. Along the way, I've made many selfish decisions in service of deepening my spiritual alignment. And by following that lead, I became the only parent that I could authentically be, for better or for worse. So I wanted to start with that premise because a lot of you in the room might be struggling with knowing how to set healthy boundaries, how to prioritize your own well-being when your child is not well or worse. And some of you may be carrying a healthy dose of doubt or self-blame or guilt or insecurity. And all of these emotions do serve some purpose, or we wouldn't feel them. But this is a parenting support group. And that means that this 1 hour together is for you. And it isn't hyperbole for me to say that the greatest gift you can give your child and the greatest gift any of us can give the world is to align ourselves spiritually. And if the word spiritual doesn't resonate, no worries. Think of it as aligning yourself with your own inner wisdom and your own loving heart. I mean looking inward and upward before we look outward. And that internal alignment becomes the foundation and our North Star. Now, if you follow that path, then by definition, since you'll be growing, you'll be uncomfortable a lot of the time. There is no growth, there is no change without discomfort. It does not always feel good to grow. Growth of any kind leads us to the edge of uncertainty. Standing on the threshold between what we know, what is familiar, and what we don't know. Change that we are transitioning into. Then we cross the threshold, we take the leap, we very possibly get slapped around a bit, and sometimes more than a bit. We expand, and then we get acclimated to that new normal until the next threshold of uncertainty and discomfort, which is the gateway to the next stage of our growth. So this time tonight with each other is for you. It's like food and water and shelter. It's nourishment for your journey. And it's your responsibility and only your responsibility to show up here for yourself. So I'm inviting you to bring that mindset to what I'm now going to share with you about polyvagal theory, which is a foundational theory for how I practice therapy and how Nest behavioral health proceeds with trauma healing. I'm going to talk to you about polyvagal theory, trauma healing, and substance use, and the human condition, just a few things. And I really would like you to resist the urge to think about my examples through the lens of your child's experience. I'm going to talk about child development a bit, about human development, and I find that parents are prone to apply these theories to their kids' experience and then identify all the things I did wrong, and that's why my kids are the way they are. It's a real vulnerability we have as parents, and there may be a time for that accountability, but tonight is not that time. Instead, think of yourself as the child. Think of your own nervous system patterns and how your emotional and physical needs get expressed and get met or not met, and what some of your own experiences were when you were a child. Essentially, I'm inviting you to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. Okay. So what is polyvagal theory and why should I care? The way I'm set up, because I'm also reading my notes at the same time, I can't see you all, or I would ask for a show of hands, but some of you may have heard of the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory. It's more and more talked about in kind of popular press. And if you haven't, you almost certainly have heard of the phrase fight, flight, freeze, which is the colloquial way of referring to states of the nervous system in which the vagus nerve is implicated. So that's what we're going to be talking about primarily. It's called polyvagal theory because even though it's one nerve, broadly speaking, it's the longest nerve of the central nervous system, it does have different segments that connect to different parts of our bodies, to our viscera. There's a segment that connects to our head and our eyes and our inner ear. There's a segment that connects to our heart space and our lungs and our throat. And there's also the bottom segment that connects to our digestive tract. Okay. All mammals and humans are no exception, have nervous systems that are constantly scanning the environment for cues of safety and danger. And we are more attuned to danger than we are to safety. The receiving of those cues and the internal flow of neurotransmitters that send messages from our viscera up to our brains and from our brains back down to our viscera, all of that process implicates the vagus nerve in a major way. So when it's dysregulated, which happens when we are taking in cues of danger or threat, including the threat of neglect or abandonment, The vagus nerve is implicated in our fight-flight response. That is an active, mobilized state of movement to fight or to flee. And also our freeze response, which is an inactive, immobilized state. Fight, flight, active, freeze, inactive, both of them dysregulated defensive states of the nervous system. Fight, flight comes first in the pecking order. So when all of that pent up adrenaline and cortisol of fight, flight has nowhere to go, in other words, in situations in which we are trapped in a situation of high emotional or physical threat, and we can't solve the problem and can't escape the problem, eventually all that adrenaline, cortisol with nowhere to go causes the vagus nerve to shut down the adrenaline and drop us into what we call dorsal activation, which is the technical reference to what we popularly call freeze. And that is a state of overwhelm, feeling flattened, hopeless, and sometimes despair. And because this nerve is connected to our viscera, chronic states of fight, flight, and freeze do have, cause physical symptoms. So people with IBS, people with Crohn's, people with ongoing digestive issues that can't be identified by a biological or medical cause. It's often because of the chronic state of dropping down into freeze and all of the activation of the dorsal portion of our vagus nerve. Okay. Many of us find that dorsal state of immobilization be highly uncomfortable. And we will develop patterns of activity to pull ourselves out of the immobilization or despair or overwhelm. So those patterns of activity might be to try to control situations that really can't be controlled, to worry, to get busy, to blame, to be hypervigilant. And all of this might not be conscious or deliberate on our parts. These are autonomic nervous system patterns, in this case, to pull us out of dorsal. Because these forms of activity don't generally lead us out of the problem we're in, because again, I'm describing a situation in which we can't solve the problem. Eventually, all those neurotransmitters associated with mobilization once again burn themselves out, and we repeat the cycle by dropping back into overwhelm. So many of my patients have lived most of their lives, if they grew up in environments that were emotionally threatening or physically threatening or both, right? They've lived most of their lives cycling through dysregulated sympathetic, mobilized fight, flight, and dysregulated dorsal freeze, overwhelm, with very limited fleeting experiences of what we call ventral vagal activation. So what is ventral? Ventral vagal activation is when the vagus nerve is regulated, which happens when we feel relatively safe and connected. That is not under physical or emotional threat. Our vagus nerve activation will correspond to either a state of play, which is active and mobilized, right? So if I'm not threatened, but I have a lot of energy and movement, you can think of that as a state of play. So that's regulated sympathetic activation is a state of play, or a state of rest and digest. So regulated immobilized energy, dorsal activation, when it's regulated, when it's not the result of threat or in response to a threat, is that exhale of rest and digest. So think about a person who feels playful, but not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So naturally playful in that state of playfulness. It might help to think of your family dog when, she greets her favorite person at the door, because mammals have all mammals have these same patterns. They're excited, elated, the tail is wagging, jumping, relaxed, free.
Emotional regulation.
I'm sorry. I thought maybe it was just feedback. I thought someone was interjecting. So you can just picture, your dog in that state, right? My dog even smiles. Humans are just like that. In this state, people are spontaneous, they're open to taking emotional risks, they're curious. These are all behaviors that correspond as to a regulated nervous system that is mobilized and energetic. Okay. Now think about a person who feels, once again, not due to the influence of drugs and alcohol, but naturally feels restful, cozy, still, at peace, calm, quiet, grounded, tired, in that way that we feel at the end of a day when we're grateful for a job well done. The exhale at the end of a long, good day. That is the regulated state of dorsal, more colloquially known as rest and digest. So I know that I'm lacking any visuals tonight, but if you can envision a quadrant, 4 boxes, right, with the upper portion being mobilized energy, the lower portion, the lower 2 boxes are immobilized because that corresponds to where our vagus nerve connects, the upper and the lower. Okay. And then think of it, even though in your body it's not left and right, but think of it as on the left-hand side, the upper left-hand quadrant is regulated ventral. That's going to be, play. It means I'm regulated sympathetic, means I'm mobilized and in a state of play, and regulated dorsal, immobilized, rest and digest. And corresponding on the right-hand side, at the top there on the upper right, dysregulated, mobilized energy is fight flight. It's fear-based and it's active, and it's a response to a neuroception, a felt sense of threat of some kind. And the dorsal is the overwhelm that comes when we simply can't fix the problem and solve it, and it drops us into dorsal. Now, why all this emphasis? Because on this lesson, why does this matter? It's, first of all, it's just the human condition. So these are autonomic nervous system responses that we cannot, we not only can we not change the basic propensity, but we wouldn't want to, because we wouldn't be alive if we didn't have access to both regulated and dysregulated. So it's important not to associate it regulated with good and dysregulated with bad. Our nervous systems are designed to fluctuate all day long between regulated and dysregulated to varying degrees. And there is such a thing as blended states. You could have a little bit of both, right? In order for us to survive and thrive. Our nervous systems are reading the environment all the time for cues of safety and danger, even when we're not consciously aware of it. Without attunement to those cues, that is, without the capacity for dysregulation of the vagus nerve, we would not survive very long. Right. So an example is, let's say I'm just about to leave my office on 86 in Central Park West, and I have gotten some really good news. I leave my office and I'm buoyant and I'm on my phone and I'm texting my husband, and I'm so excited to let him know. And I'm in a ventral state of play and excitement, right? And not aware of external threats of the environment because my nervous system state is otherwise. And I step off from the curb onto the street, about to cross the street. And just in that moment, out of the corner of my eye, I see the bus coming. There's a bus stop right in front of my office. So the bus is really close to the curb, pulling in to the stop. My nervous system switches gears autonomically without me having to think about it. Thank God, or I would be dead. And not only does it switch gears, but it knows in its wisdom, not for me not to try to fight the bus by standing in front of it and stopping it. It knows to instigate a flight response, and I jump out of the way because otherwise I'd be dead. Right. So it's kind of an extreme example, but it's a helpful one to know that we need access to our dysregulated states, meaning we need access to cues of danger in the environment in order to survive. And this is how all mammals are wired. Okay? The shifts between the states occur in response to the degree of safety and danger our nervous systems intuit or take in. So I'm going to shift and talk a little bit now more about the ways in which we are wired, right? Because even though our conditioning, meaning what we find safe and dangerous, is different for each of us because we've been conditioned, the propensity to the neuroception, we call it, the propensity to take in those cues, that's hardwired. Unless we have a traumatic brain injury or some other neurological really dysfunction in our brains, all of our normal functioning nervous systems do respond to cues of danger with defensive postures, and the cues of safety, when we can tolerate them, with relaxation interventional. And so I want to talk a little bit about the origins of polyvagal theory. So the developer of polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges, began this research about 40 years ago, and he's not a therapist, and his intention wasn't particularly to apply this to therapy or to trauma. It was actually more research on autism, interestingly, but it really wasn't applied. It was pure research. And what he says is that our drive for connection, our hardwiring to find safety and connection, is our evolutionary inheritance. That as mammals, we live in pods, in tribes, and in communities. And consistent with that theory is that the worst feeling humans report experiencing is shame. So shame is the natural, appropriate response to feeling like an outsider within our own group or from our group, to be excluded. Think of the child on the playground who's chronically excluded and made fun of. Think of the child who doesn't want to bring his friends home because his mother will be drunk by 3 p.m. Or the girl who's a late bloomer and still wants to play with Barbies when her friends have all moved on to playing with boyfriends, right? And if that word gets out, she's now excluded. She's an outsider. She knows she doesn't belong, right? Whether the word gets out or not, she has to pretend, right? So that these young people, and indeed anyone at any age, feels shame means that their nervous systems are functioning exactly as they are wired to, exactly as they're supposed to. Our impulse, that shame is the driver. It causes the impulse for us to do anything we have to in order not to feel it. That's how uncomfortable it is, in order to belong, in service of belonging. And that's because the second worst feeling most people report is loneliness. The worst thing about being excluded, why does it matter? Well, it only matters because we end up alone, and we are hardwired to find safety and community. So I want you to take a look at this gesture, which is a symbol of our desire to connect, the hand outstretched, right? This represents the ventral regulated state of safe enough and connected enough. This is how you feel when you are with your people and can relax without fear of judgment, where all of you is welcome, even though some parts of you may not be particularly likable. Some of you have heard the recovery adage that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's attachment or connection. Through the trauma lens and through the polyvagal lens, addiction is an attachment disorder. I'm going to get back to addiction in a moment, but I want to first talk about the other thing besides safety and connection that we are also hardwired for, which is protection. And that's what this looks like, protection. So protection refers to the dysregulated nervous system states induced when taking in cues of danger from the environment, the threat of abuse, judgment, physical harm, etc., or the threat of neglect, abandonment, irrelevance, non-existence, etc. Dysregulation can either take the form of hyperarousal, a fight-flight response, like the bus example, hyperarousal of jumping out of the way, or hypoarousal, being less than worried and than I should be about what the environment is sending me, right? Which sounds like this. I'm fine. It's no big deal. I don't want to make a fuss. Right? When I treat victims of domestic violence, it is their nervous system's habit of hypoarousal, underestimating the degree of danger, that interferes with their nervous system's natural protective response. This is an example of a thwarted fight response. So the habitual form of protection that nervous systems take is to dissociate from the felt sense of danger. And it looks on the outside like, I'm fine. No, really, it's no big deal. My doctor says I have high levels of mercury in my blood. There must be some rational explanation. It can't be that my husband's poisoning me. I don't want to make a fuss. And anyway, I can't prove it was him. Right? These are dysregulated states in the nervous system, even though look very calm on the outside. Still dysregulation. It's a defensive response. It's dissociation. It's dorsal. Okay. So that leads to my definition of developmental trauma, which by the way, is not a medical diagnosis, even though all of us who treat it know that it exists. What do you think happens to a child who is hardwired for both connection and protection at the same time? In a family where the person or people they need to connect with are the same people that they need to protect themselves from. That child is trapped. Can't fight, we can't flee our families of origin when we're children. And that hardwired pull to connect with and belong to our families of origin is overpoweringly strong. So that child's nervous system habits gets shaped around the need to navigate their longing to connect and their longing to protect in the context of an inescapable situation. So some of you might have been that child. I was that child. And an example would be, one of my habits was to twitch like this. So I would sit at the dinner table and my flight response was screaming inside my body to get the heck out of there. I was twitching, all that pent up energy, but there was nowhere to go. And I would fidget. I didn't know that my nervous system was naturally self-regulating, giving all that adrenaline and cortisol a way out expression, right? Until I got punished for twitching. So I stopped twitching. And then I took it private and I started hurting myself in other ways. Because my nervous system knew what it needed. None of this was conscious. It was just my vagus nerve and all of the other complexities of our nervous system desperately trying to self-regulate. So a child who has to choose constantly between connection and protection will grow up to be an adult with embedded patterns of the vagus nerve and all of the organs and other nerves that are implicated in the system that reflect their internal battle between longing for love and acceptance, not daring to long for what isn't available, fighting through and building a life somehow, dropping into overwhelm, and then the cycle of fighting and dropping perpetuated. And this is what I generally see in my office, and I call that developmental trauma. These patterns develop even if the childhood experience doesn't rise to the medical definition of trauma, which requires physical or sexual abuse or physical neglect. We know that emotional abuse and neglect of a child and what we call chronic invalidation of a child's experience, all of these experiences, when chronic and unrepaired, it's not that there's no rupture allowed, it's that there's a rupture without the repair, right? When it's occurring within a family context, that the child has no real choice but to accept that that does lead to chronic dysregulation of the vagus nerve. So the last lesson really regarding polyvagal theory is that we cannot feel safe and connected and also be on guard for protection at the same time. I mean, there are blended states. You can have a little bit of both, but when these patterns are caused by high degrees of emotional or physical threat, then or whatever, we're in a situation where our nervous system is jumping like this between the states, we actually can't. It's very, very difficult to feel both at the same time. I'm looking at the time. I was going to walk everyone through a little exercise, which I think I'm going to skip, and we might get to it, but I want to take Q&A first. But I'll just say this: try to imagine in this moment a person. Bring to mind someone who you find really objectionable. Maybe you find them threatening in some way, right? Maybe they're very judgmental of you. The holidays are coming up. Think of the person that's going to be sitting at your Thanksgiving table who is, judging you in some way, right? And that your body, just notice for a minute that your body has a physical response to that. It's a defensive response, and it's normal and natural to have that. And then try at the same time to imagine reaching out to that person for a connection. And you will probably find that it's very discombobulating within your body to try to do both. A lot of trauma treatment that's effective involves helping people hold both experiences simultaneously, because what that does is trauma causes a bifurcation within the neural pathways that cause us to bounce back and forth between defensive and non-defensive postures. And all forms of trauma therapy are aimed at opening up fluidity of the nervous system, which involves having that dual awareness of protection and connection at the same time. All right. I'm going to skip some of these. I prepared too much for you all tonight. I do want to bring this around because I understand that this parenting group, one of the themes of it is recovery, and when our children have issues with drugs and alcohol, or we have family patterns of that. And so I do just want to say a word about addiction, substance abuse, substance misuse in the context of polyvagal theory. So drugs like alcohol, cocaine, opiates all act on these nervous system patterns artificially. They artificially flood our brains with dopamine or adrenaline in ways which interfere with our naturally self-regulating neurophysiology. So this artificial intervention is a coping mechanism for patterns of vagus nerve dysregulation that we have not developed better coping mechanisms for. And because these drugs are work so instantly to shift the state of our nervous system, they do become addictive. The brain gets trained to want the quick fix because it works faster than the longer fix. And also because when we have PTSD or developmental trauma that interferes, predating the drug addiction, interferes with our ability to self-regulate. And by the way, if it starts when we're children, by definition, we haven't fully developed yet the ability to self-regulate. Our nervous systems are still getting baked, still learning, right? When it interferes with our ability to self-regulate, we literally do not have access to safe and connected within our own skin, within our own body, not enough access. So we're very vulnerable then to using drugs to temporarily shift us out of whatever the horrid feeling is that we otherwise can't tolerate. I'm sure you've all heard the concept that addiction to drugs is not the problem. It's a coping mechanism for the underlying problem. So I'm giving a perspective on what that underlying problem is, generically speaking. All right. I'm skipping some of this in the interest of time. I do want to say that even though drugs have the effect of shifting the state of our nervous system when we're dysregulated, if we're hyped up alcohol or opiates bring us down and calm us when we're depressed or immobilized. Cocaine and other uppers will rev us up, but they don't shift us to the other side of the ledger to a regulated state of mobilization or a regulated state of rest and digest. They shift us from dysregulated to dysregulated. And as a result, the cycle never ends, because as soon as a drug wears off, we're still left in that dysregulated state. And we need some other fix, if you will, some other response to it. It's not restorative to lower the state of our nervous system using alcohol. It's not nourishing the way being on a call like this with other people who care is nourishing. It's just not. It will calm us down temporarily, but once the effects have worn off, there's no long-lasting positive effect of that on the nervous system. In fact, it's the opposite. It interferes with our capacity to develop patterns of behavior that would shift us into a regulated state. All right. Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is that's why getting sober is really just the start of a journey, right? Not the end, because we are engaging in abstinence from a behavior that helped in its own way. And then all that follows is the reshaping of our nervous system patterns in all the ways I've just been describing. And it's much harder to do that than it is to just stop using, as hard as it is to stop using. But the real work starts from that point going forward, as some of you may have experienced in your own lives. All right. What a mouthful. That's a lot of information. I am going to switch to gallery view if I can, because I would love to be able to see your faces. And those of you who would like to come on screen and show us your face, that would be lovely. If not, it's totally okay as well. And yeah, I mean, I see everyone's muted. That might have been done globally. So I think probably you can each unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question or make a comment.
I have a question. So thank you for your talk. I have pretty good amount of familiarity with what you were describing, not in the detail that you were describing, but polyvagal, dysregulated, regulated. I was hoping more to hear of the treatment modalities that you use on your clients who are in dysregulated places. I'm more working with adults, and I was also wondering, is it possible, for example, men from broken homes, incarceration, substance abuse, really, really challenging backgrounds. And I was wondering, can someone be permanently dysregulated? All of it, a lot of the folks that I work with are in serious need of trauma treatment, trauma therapy. I'm just wondering what specific modalities you use.
Sure.
I get what got us there, I guess. I'm just
yeah. Thank you
what gets us out of there.
Could you just tell us a word or two about what it is that you do? It's really interesting.
Yeah, but I'm an LADC, and so I work with 30 plus year old adults with substance use disorder and common co-occurring things like depression, anxiety, occasionally some bipolar. But one group of clients that I work with, I'll call it, there's an underserved community, and there's just extraordinary amounts of trauma in the backgrounds. These are people with ACE scores of 6, 7, and 8. Incarceration in the picture, and just long histories of trauma.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And just to help others in the room. So an ACE score is a measure of adverse child experiences. So 7 or 8 is a very high So we think of it as piling on, piling on, piling on, and like the burden that that person is carrying into adulthood from, starting in their childhood, and that has shaped their nervous system patterns. So the approach so all treatment modalities for trauma therapeutic modalities aim to intervene on the nervous system in some form or another and to open up fluidity and stability. They do it in different ways, right? And they don't, if you're trained, I'm trained in a number of these, and none of them talked about polyvagal theory at the time. So even though they were referring to it and referencing it, that isn't necessarily the orientation that that developed the approaches. What the approaches are developed from is a set of diagnostic criteria in a medical journal, and it's called the DSM. And if those symptoms come down, then the method, if you will, the treatment modality is considered successful, right? But it isn't necessarily looking holistically at what is going on in the nervous system. So we can drop symptoms in one area, but that doesn't mean that the person is necessarily living a life with a regulated nervous system, right? So the fundamental difference, Vincent, of what we do at Nest is we're looking at the nervous system as the messenger. And our goal is to create greater fluidity and stability in the nervous system, right? Now, how do we measure that? That's actually still being researched. There isn't a lot of well-known ways to measure that. We use proxies for that, and there's all kinds of psychological tests, and we use all of those. So our patients all go through a very extensive assessment process. They fill out a long qualitative form, as well as fill out a lot of their psychological tests. So we're watching for signs of depression, anxiety, PTSD, et cetera. And they enter an initial assessment with me. And my goal, and then they'll get assigned to one of our therapists. And my goal when I'm doing that assessment is to get a sense of whether, given how this person is presenting, it's much less about their story. The story becomes a vehicle for me to learn about their nervous system patterns. But what I'm listening for and watching for, just by their movements in the room, right, is what degree of stability and how does that stability represent an instability of their nervous system, and what do they respond well to. So some forms of therapy are more cognitive in nature, right? We're looking at what are the distorted beliefs that this person has arrived at adulthood with, and sometimes we need to start there with the therapeutic process because their capacity to tolerate direct intervention on the nervous system through somatic interventions, even something as simple as if I tell someone to take a breath or bring their awareness to their body, some people can't handle that. They become exceedingly dysregulated just by that. So the treatment approach is to pull from a variety of modalities based on this assessment and to apply whatever that nervous system is most likely to respond well to next. So all of us are trained in a variety of modalities, EMDR, DBT. Some of you may have heard of some of these. Some are more behavioral in their approach. Some are more somatic in their approach, somatic experiencing. We have a group called Polyvagal Informed Embodied Mindfulness, where we teach not emptying the brain, meditation. What we teach is how to use cues of safety from the environment. Press your feet into the floor and feel the foundation of the floor under your feet. That has a visceral effect of sending a cue of safety to most people's nervous system, unless they have a traumatic experience of putting their feet in the floor, in which case it'll have the opposite effect. But otherwise, generally, right? And so I don't know how satisfying that answer is, but the answer is that it's an integrated, multidimensional approach with this theory as the underpinning of it. And then, one of the things I talked about is how our brains are sending messages through the vagus nerve neurotransmitters to the viscera. The viscera are sending messages to the brain. We say that story follows state, by which we mean 80% of the messages, the neurotransmitters, go from our viscera up to the brain, and only 20% from the brain down. That means that when we are in our narrative, when we are in our story, that has been driven 80% by what our nervous system intuits and has learned about cues of safety and danger, and it is driving what we believe. So we can change how we believe, and often we have to change. But if we have trauma that started pre-verbal or that started at a very young age before the prefrontal cortex was developed, I have found that cognitive therapy only takes us so far. And then we have to do the direct intervention on the nervous system to start to increase the capacity to tolerate the ventral state of relaxation. If you grew up in an environment that required hypervigilance, relaxing into the ventral state of safety and connection is its own cue of danger and induces more hypervigilance because of how dangerous it is to trust the person who it otherwise appears trustworthy because you had that experience repeatedly as a child. Did. Think about what that means, like all the self-help stuff we're getting, the messages we're getting, just do yoga, just do this, just do that. Yeah, if you can tolerate it. But what if your nervous system can't tolerate it? Then it's one more thing on the to-do list and one more thing you beat yourself up about for not having been able to engage in it, right? So it's a very titrated approach therapeutically of really listening for how does this person respond to the interventions I'm using. It's very deliberate. Nothing about it is accidental, but it is very individualized to how that person is presenting. It's complex. I wish it were simpler. If it was, I would have a book out. But it's not that simple. Not yet.
Thank you.
Chris, I think you had you unmiked.
No, not.
No? Oh, okay. You unmuted yourself.
Oh,
You might
actually, this is very shortly. I have a son that's very dysregulated, and has been in treatment now 2 10-month stints. Just came home, was great, and something flipped, and we're going backwards. But anyway, he has a brain malformation. He has a cavernous malformation. And I was just wondering when you were talking about unless you have something from your brain. So I spend so much time figuring out, are these behaviors he can't help? His happens to be an thalamus, which of course, controls everything. So boundaries and rules and, are you capable? Are you not capable? Are you defiant? Are you, and I struggle with that, and I can't find help from anybody that could help, figure this out where, they can be helped. And of course it turned into addiction because, self-medication and all of that. But anyway, that's all I wanted to ask is, if there any specific field that, deals with addiction, mental illness, and actual, brain issues.
Sorry, I was muted. And I was saying, yeah. I hear you. You've described, I think, one of the most difficult situations we encounter because finding practitioners, including in the medical field, neurologists who are integrated in their approach or holistic in their approach or looking at the whole system. There are functional medicine doctors, but you want to combine that approach with the neurology specialty. And I don't personally know somebody who does that, but that's what you would be looking for. And this is really hard to find, I think, in the medical field, is someone who's willing to say, I don't know. but let's try this. And work with you as parents, because you are on the front line, certainly, but you are also the best not informant, it's the wrong word, but the source of information, right, about what works and what doesn't, right? Having support in the home and or having an open line of communication with you, assuming your son allows it, right? Because these are behavioral, you're trying to shape behaviors in the context of brain chemistry that, is, we'll call it neurodivergent, or is might not respond in as expected to certain interventions, and then trusting that, shaping your behavior in response to that, and trusting that you are a reliable reporter about that. So a team approach, a systemic approach of, and it's very hard to find. It's easier to find here in the US than elsewhere. I can tell you in Canada, it is, from what I could tell, non-existent for much less complicated situations. So we have more access than most if we can afford it, quite frankly. But it's still, there's still a lot that we don't know.
Thank you.
Lisa or Lee, do either of you have any questions? Not to pick on you guys. Could I ask you about sound? Maria, could you talk on sound? Because Stephen Porges apparently has polyvagal music and a safe and sound protocol. I'm going to be able to hear him speak on Thursday, and they do specifically mention polyvagal music in the description of what he's talking about. So that'll be good.
Wonderful. Have you ever heard him speak before?
No, he was supposed to be at the Global Exchange Conference in Florida, but because of the hurricane, he didn't speak there, but he's doing a large webinar that I can listen to.
You will not be disappointed. He's a genuinely kind person who really cares, and then he's developed this theory that ended up just exploding in terms of its applications across the board, not only for therapy, but not only for trauma, but for so many other things. And so it's exciting. We still have him with us. He's in his 80s, but he's still with us. If you ever have a chance to hear him speak or read his books, I really recommend it.
Speaking of books, are there any other books? I know Deb Dana has written a number of books. Any books that you would recommend?
Yeah, so Deb is a good friend of mine. She is one of Stephen Porges. I don't want to say proteges, that maybe diminishes Deb a little. She's the person who has most taken polyvagal theory and applied it to the field of therapy, to that application. And any of her books are worth reading. She has, and that I have right here, there's also this polyvagal card deck, which I sometimes use with my patients.
Deb Dana.
Deb Dana, Dana. And it is, a lot of times these card decks are so gimmicky, and it's like, really? That's what I paid $15 for? It is so good. Every single card in here, there's an explanation of what's going on with it. There's a practice you can do. It's titrated. It's you don't need to work with a therapist to do this. Yeah, I mean, I recommend it. And any of her books, she has polyvagal exercises. She has Stephen Porges and his son came out with a book last year called My Polyvagal World. One of the problems Dr. Porges' writings, he's an academic, is they can be really inaccessible and hard to get through. Some of his earlier stuff, especially. So he came out with My Polyvagal World, I think it's called, him and his son. and it's in layman's language. It's very accessible, very easy to understand, with examples that you'll relate to potentially.
Thank you.
Well, we have a number of people in the audience that are usually very vocal and ask a lot of questions, but they're being a little shy today. But you know, this is a difficult concept, and but it's basically something where, you know, once you have the understanding, and you know, it's like a language. It's learning a new language, but it can be so beneficial because let's just take the world of EMDR, and I want to get, you know, I'd be interested in your view of how many people that you would assess. Do you think, let's say that they come through your office and you assess them, how many would benefit from EMDR? Is it 50% that come through, or?
More than 50%.
Okay.
The vast majority would benefit. So people don't realize that EMDR is not, I mean, if you know, when let me see a show of hands for those of you who are on the screen, who has heard of EMDR and knows generally what it is. Okay, very educated group. So yeah, so people think of EMDR as the bilateral stimulation, whether it's this or the light going back and forth or the buzzers in your hands, right? But the bilateral stimulation itself, which is used during the stage of EMDR that we call trauma processing, right, is the 4th out of 8 stages of EMDR treatment. So EMDR actually starts with an assessment of the trauma history and an assessment of that person's nervous system stability, right? In the EMDR training, they kind of give that short shrift, whereas, you know, we give it a lot of time. But people who practice EMDR will tell you, you know, who practice it thoughtfully, will tell you that sometimes those early stages of stabilizing the nervous system before moving into trauma processing, before identifying what the traumas are that are going to be processed and moving into the actual processing, that could take 6 or 9 months. Now, in the training, they don't tell you that, because all of these methods of treatment that are evidence-based, right? How do they become evidence-based? They become evidence-based because they prove that it lowers the DSM symptoms, in this case for PTSD, right? That's what makes it, they have to prove that they lower the symptoms, and it has to be replicable, meaning it has to follow a protocol. So the protocol is, in session 1, you do this, in session 2, you do that. And over 16 sessions or 24 sessions, you complete the protocol. But the actual nervous system that's in the room may need 16 sessions just to tolerate being able to move into trauma processing, because we're doing all kinds of other things of stabilizing the nervous system first, right? So that's a situation. Those are situations where someone says, I tried EMDR and it didn't work, because I did, you know, 3 EMDR sessions when I was in rehab and it didn't work, right? Well, because chances are, because it wasn't done with this perspective of what the stages of treatment are, and taking the time to move through each stage and not move on to the next stage. So when I talked about a multidimensional approach, EMDR and psychodrama, those are the 2 that come closest to themselves being a full, integrated, multidimensional approach from beginning to end, right? That I'm aware of. We also, you know, there are other methods as well, and we use those too: somatic experiencing, cognitive therapy, as I said, dialectic. I mean, sometimes we'll do DBT skills training for the first 6 months. For those of you who know what that is, you know, it's, how do I not blow my life up? How do I stop blowing my life up? I stop blowing my life up by following these rules, right? And we need to do that before we move into trauma processing. Trauma processing is wildly evocative. It means that we're bypassing the protective, defensive postures of the nervous system and getting underneath to the very worst thing that the reason we have PTSD in the first place is because we couldn't tolerate that very worst thing. That's why we developed it. That's the definition of why we develop PTSD. So we can't just take a person and throw them into the deep end. We have to lead up to it. And DBT skills training is an example of how that's done.
Wow. Well, so you started in New York and so Nest, is it based in Connecticut, in Greenwich, or is it based in New York, or both?
So most of our clinicians work out of our New York office, and my home base was always in New York until very recently. I see patients personally in New York, and we also have an office in Greenwich, and so we see patients in person in Greenwich as well. But most of our practice is based in New York or is on telehealth. Our in-person practice is primarily in New York, but we also see patients in Greenwich. And then, our therapists are licensed all over the place. And so each of us have different licensures in different states. Like you have to be licensed in the state that you practice, and each state has its own rules, right? So we do see patients, and I'm licensed in Florida as well, so for telehealth. So I see patients who are in Florida, and a number of my clinicians do as well. That's a case by case thing.
Lisa, do you have a question?
I do. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Maria. I'm just listening to what you're saying about, my own son has been in several rehabs. My brother's been in several rehabs, and I'm so intrigued that more and more of them now say, we do EMDR, we do psychodrama, but they're 30-day programs. So really what you're saying is there's no way you can effectively do EMDR in 30 days.
For someone who's in early recovery, who's
Yeah.
just getting sober,
Yeah.
it's a long shot.
Yeah.
Now,
okay.
you can use bilateral stimulation to help regulate the nervous system, which is not, it's like it's like,
Yeah.
that's actually not what we use bilateral stimulation for when we do EMDR.
Right.
But it can, at least not exactly. But sometimes if someone's been through several rounds of treatment, so even though they're early in recovery, they're really not, they might be newly sober again, but they might be able to tolerate some trauma processing. I think I don't want to second guess the assessment that a treatment facility is making of that. I would certainly, if I was your son's therapist, I'd be asking those questions. If I was the outside therapist, I'd be like, so tell me what role that is going to play in the course of treatment. But sometimes they can make a case for it. So
seems like it's more of a marketing pitch, to be honest.
Psychodrama. Well, and so psychodrama also, I've visited many of the major rehabs all over the country, and because they do professionals weekends and they have us over and we get to meet their clinicians and we get to sometimes sit in on or observe some of the treatment groups. And typically in a 30-day program, psychodrama is not open-ended trauma processing. It's what they call psychodrama is actually very structured and has a very narrow goal for that particular session. It's rare. I think I've never seen, other than in a trauma track, in a trauma program, but in a straight SUD 30-day program, I've never seen them try to do thank goodness, open-ended psychodrama. The difference is that with open-ended psychodrama, the drama can go anywhere. The facilitator is just following the protagonist, and it can go to the worst experience that person has ever had. It's wherever their nervous system takes them. And if they're new in recovery, even though, at least they're in a facility, so they're safe because they're in the facility, but they're going to end up just dissociating because it's going to be overloads more than their nervous system can actually tolerate. So they're not going to actually get much trauma processing done. Yeah. And it can be quite traumatic itself. It can actually further embed the trauma, right? So it's why we want to really titrate it. but you can use experiential role play methods that are psychodrama-like, that are offshoots of psychodrama and all part of the umbrella of those techniques, but that are much more narrow. Like, let's have an empty chair for your addiction. What do you want to say to your addiction? That's a very narrow role play. We want to reverse roles with your addiction. Like, that can be managed in early recovery and, to good effect. And they'll call it psychodrama, but, yeah.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
you're muted, Paul.
Would you take one more question from Anita and Andrew?
I would love to, and then I'm going to respectfully say goodnight.
Yeah.
It's a quick question. Thank you, by the way, Maria. Does somebody have to be in recovery for this treatment? Because I find that a lot of the treatments that my son has gone through, oh, well, you have to be sober first, but then
Oh, no.
sober because he's not feeling well.
Yeah, no. So, yeah. Sorry, but you're striking on a pet peeve of mine, which is the idea that someone comes to treatment for their addiction and then they're not allowed to engage in treatment unless they're no longer addicted is just very counterintuitive to me. So, part of the assessment that we do is for substances. So if someone is very active, and we're not substance primary, so if someone is very active in an addiction and need a level of support for their addiction that I can't provide, I don't have an IOP, I don't have the wraparound services, they might work with a sober coach. I work, hand in glove with many of the, we probably know some of the same people in this room, right? Some of the top sober coaches and companions in the country, they do really good work when they're well trained. And when they're trained in this, from this perspective, it really makes a difference in how they coach and companion. And I will work hand in glove. Our therapist can do therapy if we know that the patient is safe and is attending to their drug use, which might or might not mean that it's sobriety right off the bat, but the parameters around that all get discussed and negotiated literally in advance. So there's like conditions, like if we're going to see you, you need to do this, this, and this. Oh, your goal is sobriety. Then we got to make sure you have the structures in place. We're going to use SoberLink, or we're going to have a companion, or you're going to attend this IOP. And then in addition to that, you can work at the same time with one of our therapists for the therapy piece that is everything other than the behavioral approach to how do I just not use, right? And all of the relational components of, how I manage relationships with others and with myself, which, all of these patterns I was talking about today is implicated in, right? That all gets dealt with in therapy, and it drives the therapeutic approach. So we might not be doing EMDR with someone who has a very high, I shouldn't say we wouldn't be doing EMDR. We might not be doing trauma processing phase of EMDR with someone who's in early recovery and just trying to not use, right? Because opening up that access to the worst thing that they experience in their nervous system might be too much, more than they can handle at that time, until they have more stability and more practices in place for safety. So that's all. I mean, we're highly collaborative. It's really a hallmark of how I've always I started my career at Freedom Institute. So some of you may know Freedom back before it got purchased by Silver Hill. We were always extremely collaborative, working with the outside therapists. And now I'm on the outside and I'm always working, I really see it as a systemic approach, working with the family and working with other providers who can support. I'm seeing them a couple of times a week for an hour. It's yeah.
That's good, because it's so frustrating. We've gone through so many people, and as soon as they find out that, he self-medicates, oh, sorry, can't work with him. But
I understand.
Yeah, so
yeah, no, I
right,
understand.
thank you.
Yeah, he's self-medicating for a reason.
Yeah. Wow. This was very helpful and hopeful. I think some of the other parents would say that, because we're always looking for new pathways of recovery. And this isn't necessarily new, and it's not like a single pathway, but you opened up the world to us. So I really appreciate that, Maria, and I hope some of you out there will join me in thanking Maria for coming here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your time tonight, and your listening, your captive audience, because I talked and talked for that breath. So
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was
Thank you.
great.
Really informative. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
You as
you.
well.
Have a good
you so
evening.
much. Good night.